Okay, so welcome to the deep dive, everyone. Today we're looking at something pretty fundamental to how we live our lives, something that structures our days, whether we think about it or not, daily routines.
Exactly.
And we have some really interesting material for this deep dive from the English Leap podcast.
Okay.
Specifically their episode called Talk About Daily Routine, which offers this really interesting sort of structured way of thinking about this.
Right. Think of it as us kind of like distilling the essence of that discussion for you so you can have a clearer understanding of not just what constitutes a daily routine, but also the common ways that we talk about it.
Exactly.
The goal here is that by the end of this, you'll have a sharper sense of how these everyday patterns are described, which can be useful in all sorts of situations, even beyond just understanding English. It really touches on the universal experience of how we organize our time.
I think that's such a good point. And, you know, the English Leap podcast episode gives us this really helpful framework for how we articulate our days. And I think, you know, what a better place to start than at the start of the day.
Right.
So let's jump right into the morning and see how they break down that familiar stretch, you know, from when we first open our eyes to when we're ready to face the world, or for many of us now, just our workspace at home.
Okay, so the podcast begins by looking at those like initial moments of awakening.
Yes.
And they make a really interesting point about the distinction between wake up and get up.
Okay.
You might wake up at 6:30 a.m., meaning you're no longer asleep.
You're right.
Your eyes might be open, but then the act of physically getting out of bed might happen a little later, say 6:45 a.m. It's that small gap.
That's so true.
That transition from being awake to being active that the language captures.
Yes, that liminal space.
Yeah.
Between sleep and actually starting the day. So according to the English Leap podcast, then, what usually follows that moment of getting out of bed?
Well, they touch on some like really common actions that tend to happen fairly quickly after getting up.
Okay.
First, brush my teeth. The example they use is I brush my teeth as soon as I get up, which emphasizes how immediate this action is for a lot of people.
Right.
Then comes wash my face, often done to feel fresh and awake.
Yeah.
It's those little rituals
Absolutely.
that signal the true beginning of our active day.
Those initial steps.
Yeah.
To shake off the last vestiges of sleep.
Yeah.
And then before we even think about food, some people opt for a quick rinse.
Right. The podcast brings up take a quick shower before breakfast.
Okay.
And they present this as a fairly routine part of the morning for some.
Yeah.
Almost a way to kind of mentally and physically prepare for what's ahead. You know, it makes you wonder
That's a good point.
about the different routines people have. Some might shower at night,
Right.
others in the morning.
Exactly. And it really highlights, I think, how personal these routines can be, even though there are these sort of common threads. Okay, so let's move on to what I think a lot of people consider a very crucial part of the morning. Breakfast.
Yes.
What kind of language does the podcast focus on around this meal?
So they give us a couple ways that we commonly talk about breakfast. The general way is have breakfast at 7 a.m., giving a specific time.
Right.
But then to be more descriptive, they use the example, eat toast and eggs for breakfast.
Ooh, toast and eggs. A timeless classic for many.
It shows how we can be both general about the activity and specific about what we actually consume.
Exactly. Okay, so we're awake, we're feeling refreshed.
Yeah.
And we have something to eat. What's the next phase then in getting ready to tackle the day?
So this is where we shift to preparing ourselves for either going out into the world or starting our workday from home. The podcast points out the simple but essential phrase, get dressed, for putting on our clothes. And then for those who wear makeup, put on makeup before leaving the house.
Okay.
It's all about those actions that make us feel ready to face whatever the day holds.
So we've gone through the initial wake up, the hygiene rituals, fueling up, and getting ready. Now we move from our sort of personal preparation to the next big step for many getting to work or school.
The podcast smoothly transitions us by focusing on the act of leaving our homes. The core phrase here is leave the house at 8 a.m.
Okay.
Again, providing that specific time marker.
Yeah.
That often dictates the flow of our morning routine.
And of course, the way we leave the house can vary dramatically, depending on where we live and what our day involves.
Yeah.
The English Leap podcast touches on these different modes of transport, doesn't it?
Yes, they cover a couple of the most common scenarios.
Okay.
For those who use public transportation, the example is take the bus to work.
Right.
And for those who drive, the straightforward phrase is drive to work every day.
Yeah, it's interesting how ingrained these modes of transport become in our daily narrative.
It really is.
But as we all know,
the
traditional commute has changed significantly for a lot of people.
For sure.
The podcast acknowledges this shift in how we start our workday.
Absolutely. They specifically include the example, I start work at 9 a.m. from my home office.
Yeah.
This reflects the reality. For a large and growing segment of the workforce, where the commute might just be a walk to another room in the house.
Right.
It highlights how our language has adapted to these changes in our daily structure.
So whether it's a physical journey across town, or a short walk to our home workspace, we eventually arrive at our work or school. What kind of initial actions does the podcast highlight once we get there?
So they provide a couple of very typical first steps. In a work context, the example is, I check my emails when I get to work.
It's so common, such a common starting point.
This is so relatable for so many professionals. And then for those in education, the phrase is, I attend my first class at 9 a.m., marking the official beginning of the academic day.
So checking emails.
Yeah.
Heading to that first class. Definitely routine.
It really shows how our routines are often dictated by the demands of our work or studies.
And what are the other activities that typically fill our work day or school day?
Well, the podcast touches on the collaborative aspect of work with the example, I have a meeting with my team at 10 a.m.
Okay.
This underscores how scheduled events and interactions with colleagues or classmates often form a key part of our daily structure and rhythm.
It makes you think about how much of our day is actually pre-planned versus more spontaneous.
A good point.
All that work and learning can certainly build up an appetite. Let's move on to the midday break. What does the English Leap podcast tell us about how we talk about lunch?
The standard phrase they mention is, I have lunch at 12:30 p.m. Again, giving us a common time slot for this midday pause.
But of course. It's rarely just that sort of one standard scenario, is it?
Exactly. The podcast makes sure to point out that there are different ways we approach this meal, depending on our circumstances and preferences.
Absolutely.
So they give us examples like, go out for lunch, which implies leaving the workplace or school for a meal.
Right.
Perhaps for a change of scenery or to socialize. And then there's the very common and often more budget-friendly option, bring my lunch from home.
Yeah, cooking at home versus ordering in. That's a daily decision for so many.
These two examples really cover the main ways that people handle their midday nourishment.
Okay, so we've navigated the morning and the first part of the working day. Now we transition into the afternoon and evening, which for many of us is about wrapping up professional commitments and perhaps engaging in other activities or winding down.
That's right. The podcast mentions some typical activities that happen after work or school.
Okay.
Go to the gym or exercise in the evening are highlighted for those who prioritize fitness in their routine. And for relaxation, the phrase relax and watch TV after work is given as a common way to unwind.
That balance is so important, isn't it?
It really is.
Between those more structured parts of the day and the time that we dedicate to leisure or personal pursuits.
Exactly. And of course, another really significant part of the evening for most people is dinner.
Yes. What does the podcast tell us about how we talk about that meal?
So the general phrase, as you might expect, is simply have dinner.
Right.
And just like with lunch, the podcast provides a couple of common scenarios for how this meal comes together.
Okay.
You might cook dinner at home, which often involves planning and preparation, Or for convenience, you might order food online.
Right. These really reflect the common choices many of us face in our evening routines.
They do.
As the day begins to wind down then, we naturally move into our nighttime routines, those activities that help prepare us for sleep.
The podcast mentions calming activities like take a shower before bed, which is a routine many find relaxing.
Right. A warm shower and a good book. That sounds pretty ideal to me.
And conducive to sleep. And for those who enjoy, a bit of quiet time before sleep. Read a book before going to sleep is another typical part of a night routine they highlight. These actions often serve as signals to our bodies that it's time to slow down.
And finally, we arrive at the moment we've all been unknowingly progressing towards. Throughout this discussion, sleep.
Yes.
How does the podcast describe going to bed?
The common way to describe the end of the day and the transition to sleep, according to the podcast, is I go to bed at 10 p.m.
Oh.
This provides a clear marker for the end of one day and the anticipation of the cycle beginning anew.
It's interesting how we use these specific times to frame these key moments in our routine. Yeah. So from the moment we wake up all the way to when we finally go to bed. The English Sleep Podcast gives us this really clear and relatable framework for understanding and talking about our daily routines.
And the real insight here, I think, as the podcast itself underscores, is just how fundamental routine is to our lives and the surprisingly consistent language we employ to describe these patterns, regardless of our individual circumstances.
And for you, the listener, this deep dive, inspired by the English Sleep Podcast, hopefully offers more than just a list of phrases. It provides, I think, a structured way to think about the flow of your own day and the common expressions we all use to navigate and communicate those structures.
Exactly.
It's not just about understanding the English language. It's about reflecting on the very architecture of our daily lives and how we articulate those routines.
This brings up a really interesting point for you to consider as you've listened to us. Break down these common routines and the language around them. How does your own daily rhythm compare? What are the non-negotiable parts of your day? And what might the structure of your routine, the habits you've consciously or unconsciously formed, reveal about your own priorities and the way you choose to spend your time?
That is something worth reflecting on.
It really is.